On behalf of the Student Equity Work Group, it is my distinct pleasure to welcome you to the first event this semester for our Student Equity Speaker Series. My name is James Noel and my pronouns are he, him, his. I am Dean of English and Equity Pedagogy and co-chair the Student Equity Work Group, along with Dr. Sangha Niogi from Sociology. Each year, the Student Equity Work Group chooses a theme from our speaker series. In the past, we've had themes such as undoing injustice, rise by lifting, indigeneity and cultivating critical hope. Today, this year, our theme is health justice, reimagining health and wellness. Health justice means organizing from the ground up, social change that transforms the current systems of neglect, bias, and privilege into systems, policies, practices, institutions that truly support healthy communities for all. While access to quality healthcare is crucial, health injustice involves many more dimensions than the availability and distribution of healthcare. This session is being recorded, and even though we're in a virtual space, we must acknowledge that Diablo Valley College is situated on the ancestral lands of the Bay Miwok people. We name the history of this beloved place as a gesture of respect and reparation towards the indigenous residents of the colonized land we now call home. We acknowledge the profound suffering caused by the theft and colonization of this land and grieve the ongoing systematic harm on Miwok culture. As well as to all the indigenous cultures of what we now call North America, we honor the Bay Miwok as the ancestral stewards of this land and are actively working to build the right relationship. Before handing over the program, a reminder to please fill out our survey at the end of the event. We will post the TD URL for easy access. If you would like to watch last year's session or earlier events, you can find the recordings on our webpage. I now invite our talented librarian, Lindsay Shiverley, to introduce our amazing speaker for today.
Thanks so much, James. Hi, everybody. My name is Lindsay. I am a reference librarian here at Diablo Valley College, and I'm part of the team that puts together this wonderful speaker series. I want to start by just welcoming our guests from all over, and especially our DVC students. We are really so glad that you're here for this important conversation. Thank you for your presence today. It is my honor to introduce Malkia Devich-Cyril. Malkia is an activist, writer, and public speaker on issues of digital rights, narrative power, Black liberation, and collective grief. They are the founder and former executive director of MediaJustice, which is a national organization that boldly advances racial justice, rights, and dignity in the digital age. MediaJustice is beloved by librarians everywhere, and the MediaJustice movement fights for a future where we are all connected, represented, and free, which sounds like a world that I want to live in. Malkia is a thinker and powerhouse leader for the movement for Black lives. They have written dozens of publications, are a regular featured speaker, and have appeared in several documentaries, including 13th, which, of course, was nominated for an Oscar and directed by Ava DuVernay. For more than 20 years, Malkia has championed the media and technology rights of communities of color and other underrepresented groups to demand and win equity in our digital age. As the widowed spouse of comedian and editor Malkia Devich-Cyril, who died following an intense 2-year battle with cancer, Malkia now works to transform the public narrative on grief and equity in America. And when we were imagining the speaker series this year and our health justice theme, Malkia was the first name that came to mind. We wanted to think together about racism as a public health issue, particularly using Ruth Wilson Gilmore's framing of racism as state-sponsored vulnerability to premature death. And in this frame, grief then becomes central to our anti-racist work to build a more just world where we can access the care we need and thrive together in healthy communities. And Malkia's work and leadership is instrumental in figuring out how we're going to get there. So Malkia, I am so pleased to welcome you to Diablo Valley College. Thank you for being here today.
Thank you, and I'm very honored by the invitation. I want to start off by just acknowledging that a community member and friend to many has today or yesterday was mugged and is in intensive care, ICU, and we don't know the prognosis as of yet. So I want to just acknowledge that this conversation that we're having about grief, about the peril and the power of grief, and in particular, Black grief, is it's not some esoteric, conversation for other people. This is a conversation for us all right now, in a very immediate way. So I'm just gonna put some love and prayers in the air for her journey, and may it be peaceful. I'm gonna begin today by sharing, in the way that I do, a poem. There will be living after all. There are decades that shatter everything that you are. Collapse it, stomach to back, till the 3 dimensions it once was now fit flat onto the page. Maybe our children will read the story of us. Maybe one day our children, those who survived the 21st century, will read that there are years littered with human longing. Loss stretched across the memory, exponential, a shadow over 3,650 afternoons, 600,000 bodies lost to one disease, shade from an unbearable, blinding, and unbearably binding truth. There will be living after all. There are decades sojourned like an open casket, Black death on high rotation on digital display, high-tech loss immortalized in ways found can never be, not when the air we breathe is saturated with force and lies, the parents of an empirical grief that partitions the memory, its absence gnawing a desperate dementia, the kind with pieces you don't want to pick up, so you leave them where they fell. You let them be familiar breadcrumbs of a life, a marked trail, a masterful alchemy of moments, a hidden transcript, love's pidgin dialect. I speak you and remember how you rolled off the tongue. My God, I know this road too well. This artery of land where my memory is sunless, hungry, and alone, or a trial that always finds me guilty, insufficient, weaker than I'm meant to be, though I follow it then, through back streets and alleyways, back to the moon in your eyes, and I'm remembered again. There will be living after all. Even though we walked, my love, I know that it felt more like we shivered against a brutal night. It felt more like we crawled into and out of hospital beds, more medical patient than person, a withered kind of lonely, 1 foot in love's mass grave and 1 foot in its rebirth. I know it seems that way. Like death is all we have, like life is full of loopholes, like what we dreamed was just that, aspiration and holy grail doomed to fail. But if you're like me, grief may mark you, raise you keloid and braided, pockets and decades full of loss. A quilt of time pulled tight over a buried past, stitched across those broken moments. A whole life spoken in the parlance of tears. If you're like me, grief might arm you, might wield your open tumult in full public view until you are a border of absence, a juggernaut of lonely, perpetually estivated in a burning sorrow, the heart's affliction militarized by deep, cold rage. If you're like me, grief might crown you in season, a solstice ordained by life's forfeiture. If you are willing to ascend to love's trembling heights like me, be an unwitting student in a master class on meeting God with every verdant breath like my beloved, yes, baby, do you remember? Do you remember before life's lambent afterglow? Do you remember how it was the sharp, sweet sap of death that bled you from each day, left you satisfied as worked land, sagacious and steaming, and threaded through my every open door? Yes, remember, remember. I have loved and been loved completely. Grief to the mirror might say, I am love. If you're lucky, if you're lucky, if you're lucky like me. So, if you wondering what I've been up to, if you came to ask after me, let me tell you, I've been a crescent moon defended against the soft night. I've been training for freedom, for that day when hope and history align, when dead languages let me speak to you again alive. And on that day, they gonna probably call me crazy. They probably gonna redact my victories, tell me to get myself together. But I will not pick up the parts of me discarded by disease, distorted relations of power. I leave my loving on the ground, planted like old seed in new earth. My memory gon' unpave the streets. My love gon' carry on the wind. My wife is not lost to me, though she may be dead. None of my dead are lost. As they leave no lack in me, I will leave nothing out, nothing. Because there will be living after all. There will be living after. And so let's take a breath. I know that you're in your house or in a classroom or wherever it is you are, but I want to invite a breath right now. I want to dedicate this conversation to all of you, to every one of you who is missing someone, for every one of you that has lost someone, a parent, a grandparent, a cousin, a spouse, a child. This is a conversation about how we transform that which we have lost into inspiration, into meaning. From loss to liberation is the journey that I want to be on today with you. Again, thank you so much. I'm here to have a conversation with you about the role and impact of Black grief in America. For the last couple of years, I've taken on this study of grief as social condition, as public narrative, as political and movement strategy. And I focused on trying to understand the peril, the danger of unprocessed grief to our bodies, and the power and the potential of collective, almost congregational grief, what we can do with public mourning, looking at the difference between grief that isolates and harms versus grief that connects us and helps us build a better world.
Hey, Malkia.
Yes.
Apologies. You've moved a screen over that is slightly covering your presentation.
Oh, is that right?
Yeah.
How about now?
Perfect. We're good.
Okay, thank you so much. I didn't realize that that was going to cover it.
Yeah.
Thank you for letting me know. So I've been reading this anthology. Y'all can see the whole quote now. I've been reading this anthology, and the anthology is called Rebellious Morning. And it begins with a quote from Subcomandante Galeano. He's a Zapatista rebel on the 43 disappeared students. He said, your struggle is a crack in the wall of the system. Don't allow it to close up. Your children breathe through that crack, but so do the thousands of others who have disappeared across the world. So that the crack does not close up, so that the crack can deepen and expand, you will have in us Zapatistas a common struggle, one that transforms pain into rage, rage into rebellion, and rebellion into tomorrow. Now, I love that quote. I love that quote because it symbolizes exactly the way I think about grief. A grief that can fuel radical change. And in particular, I think that is the role and power and potential of Black grief, to transform pain into rage, to transform rage into rebellion, and rebellion into a future we deserve. Like many of you, I've lost many loved ones. In fact, to some degree, it seems that loss is actually a feature of the Black experience in America. Now, for me, I believe I grieve because I love. You know, social scientist Judith Butler wrote, let's face it, we're undone by each other. We're undone by each other, and if we're not, we're missing something. You know, we all have a story. We all have a story of loss and grief, but for some, race, class, gender, and other factors make grief less of a personal story and more of a way of life, more than an experience. It's the air that we breathe, you know, it's the water that we drink. It's passed down from generation to generation, and whether it's a gift or whether it's a curse, is really depends on how we process and use that grief. My mom named me Malkia Amala. It means Queen of Hope in Arabic. Now, she might have got the gender wrong, but she got the message right, you know. My sister's name means peace is alive and well. She definitely got that right. Our mother gave us these names because as a Black single mother, raising two Black children, as a member of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, which she was in 1966, as a founding member of the Black Panther Party in the New York chapter, and the head of the BPP Breakfast Program and Liberation School, my mom knew, right? She knew that we was gonna need names that could pull us through. She knew that we was gonna need names that could carry us through the devastation an anti-Black, anti-woman, anti-child, anti-poor, anti-indigenous, anti-immigrant, anti-queer, and trans world can bring. She knew then. She died at the age of 59 from the fatal genetic disease, sickle cell anemia. My aunt died at the age of 58 from alcoholism. Dozens of my family members and friends died in fires. They died in a stream of bullets. They died because of intimate partner violence. They died from other diseases. My wife died 4 years ago at the age of 42 from cancer. All of these people that I loved were Black, born in a world that kills Black people much younger, more frequently, and more traumatically than any group in America except for Native Americans. The writer, Claudia Rankine, wrote, "The condition of Black life is one of mourning." I think that my life bears out the truth that we were born into grief, that as Black folk, we are born in some ways, not just to grief, but to grieve. My mom used to tell me so many stories about the many members of the Black Panther Party killed by the police. She told us about how the FBI's counterintelligence program in the 1960s infiltrated and destroyed the Panthers. I grew up going to court to free Black political prisoners, working on their campaigns. I'm still doing that. My sister does that. It's a lifelong struggle. But whether killed by the cops, whether spied on or jailed, the trauma of the government's response to Black activism lingered long past the 1960s. It clung to Black communities and social movements as grief. The loss of these activists, of the activists of the civil rights movement, of the activists in the South African freedom movement, this was a message to everyone. If you stand up for freedom, you or somebody you love might die. You know, they murdered Fred Hampton, a Black Panther, and that message was clear. If you stand up, you might die. I witnessed firsthand the way systemic and unattended grief can weaken our will to participate in change making. How it can steep in our bones like fear. How it can freeze us and make us unable to take the kind of action we need to build the world we deserve. How it can fracture our families. I know that some of you know what I'm talking about. How we can destroy our neighborhoods, how we can destroy our freedom movements, the same movements that we need to survive this period that we're in of mass and manufactured death. Now, I think that you know what I'm talking about. I think you know what I mean by mass death. I was thinking to myself, do I need to really explain what I mean by mass death? Let me see if I can break it down. So between 2020 and 2023, more than 30,000 children in California lost a parent or caregiver to COVID-19. More than 30,000 children in California lost a parent or caregiver to COVID-19. I want you to think about what that means for California's services, for California's foster care system, for California's educational system, for California's criminal justice system, for California's debt. I mean, just think about what it means that we did not have a country that could care enough for us to help keep us healthy. Instead, 30,000 California children lost a parent or a caregiver to COVID-19, and the vast majority were Black. As of February 1st, 2023, a total of 1,106,824 COVID-19 deaths have been reported in the US right now. Okay, right now we're losing approximately 500 people every day to this disease. In California specifically, we've lost 102,522 lives. Mass death. In 2022, every week the virus was still killing hundreds of Californians. Now, thank goodness we are at 80% decrease in deaths since the beginning. So we are grateful for that. But it's 3 years later. It's 3 years later, and the failure of our public health system has resulted in not just an experience of mass loss, but an experience of mass grief that is unequal and racially divided. Let me tell you something. In 2020, nearly 1 in 3 Black people in America knew somebody who died from COVID. And for every single death to COVID-19 or related complications, at least 9 additional people were affected, leaving a child, a grandparent, a parent, a spouse, an aunt or uncle or other family member or friend to survive them. This is how collective grief is born. Now, you know what I mean when I say mass death. Sometimes the word mass means widespread, but sometimes it means widely felt. We felt it when we watched George Floyd die on television, when we watched Keenan Anderson tased repeatedly to death during a mental health crisis in Los Angeles, when we watched Ahmaud Arbery hunted and killed. Modern networked communications platforms mean that police killings are experienced as a mass event. In the first 8 months of 2020, 164 Black lives were ended by law enforcement. At least 200 Black people were killed by police officers in the US in 2021. We account for 27% of people killed in 2021 and 24% of those killed in 2022, but we only 13% of the population in the United States. We experience death more than most. In fact, when we talk about killing, right? When we talk about killing, by U.S. law enforcement. I'm talking about the fact that it reached a record high in 2022, make about 100 people a month, making it the deadliest year on record for police violence since 2013, when experts first started tracking killings nationwide. And let me tell you, research by the group Mapping Police Violence found that Black people are 3 times more likely to be killed by police, but 1.3 times more likely to be unarmed compared to white folks. While Black residents make up only 7% of the combined population of Alameda, Contra Costa, San Francisco, San Mateo, and Santa Clara counties, we accounted for a staggering 27% of those killed by police in the region since 2015. Okay, now I can tell you all these stats. I can break down, all the different ways that Black people are overrepresented in police killings, but I don't need to do that. You already know that. You see it. You witness it on a regular basis. But I don't know. I mean, maybe you don't know what I mean by mass death. I think you do. Did you know that in a nation that committed a systemic genocide against them, Native American communities are reported as having the lowest income, the least education, the highest poverty level of any group in the United States, and the lowest life expectancy? I'm just trying to say the historic harms continue to take lives. The past is present. The past is present. And I want to share with you just a brief story about that. Starting in the 19th century, Canada was home to a system of residential schools. Now, y'all might have heard about this, mostly operated by churches, and Indigenous children were forced to attend those schools after being removed from their families by settlers, by colonists, by the Catholic Church. The last of those schools closed in 1996. But 2 years ago, in 2021, a mass grave with 215 Indigenous children was uncovered in British Columbia, Canada. 215 children. 215 children. They had gone missing from one of the largest residential boarding schools in California. It was only one of dozens of schools reported to have missing Indian children. Now, that pain, right? That shared experience of child loss, that shared experience of the loss of land, life, language, and liberty, that has been passed down generationally, and it is felt today. Black people feel that and have experienced that in that same way. The experience of chattel slavery passed down, resulting in psychological distress today, resulting in chronic health issues today, resulting in patterns of addiction today. When people say slavery happened however many hundreds of years ago, what they don't understand is that the effect of a mass collective trauma is mass collective grief, and that is passed down. It is passed down. It is passed down. You know what I mean by mass death. The Gun Violence Archive, a nonprofit that tracks shootings in the US, recorded 647 mass shootings in 2022. Gun violence overall killed more than 44,000 people in the US in 2022, making it the deadliest year for gun violence yet. We're talking about, that includes murders at LGBTQ nightclubs. That includes the white supremacist murder of Black folk in Buffalo. That includes the murder of 19 children in Uvalde. This is not just about gun violence. These attacks are racialized. They disproportionately impact communities of color, and they are disproportionately, the shooters are disproportionately white men, though not always white, but almost always men. This means something. Now, one of the things that I want this to lead to, I want us to understand that this moment we're living in is a grief moment. Everything that I've just described to you, these are examples. These are examples of how we are living through not just individual experiences of loss, but a collective experience of loss. And as a result, we're having a collective experience of grief. That matters. And in that collective experience of grief, it hits differently for different communities. I'm going to talk a little bit about how it hits Black communities. Now, in my research, I found that this woman, Deborah Umberson, she talks about grief as an unrecognized racial burden, right? That leads to disproportionate disadvantage. You know, so I guess I want to say by way of that in a nation founded on the chattel enslavement of blacks, the land theft and genocide of Native people, and the enforced hierarchy of white supremacy and racial capitalism, these are all terms we can define later. But in that world, right, in that world, loss and grief and its consequences end up reproducing inequalities. Let me say it a different way. When this loss is unequal, right? And when unequal loss is our environment, unequal grief becomes our context, if that makes sense. I hope it does. So let's talk about grief's racial burden, the three types. Number one, I found that one primary way that grief shows up as having a racial burden that impacts Black folk is disparate mortality, which creates greater exposure to grief. Just like when we talk about increased policing in Black communities actually results in increased police violence. So the more contact you have with the police, the more likely you are to be a victim of police violence. Same thing goes for loss. The more loss you experience, the more likely you are to grieve, and the more grief you experience, the more likely you are to have resulting consequences, health consequences, and all kind of stuff. Consequences like your own premature death, right? And other kinds of chronic health issues. Black folk are exposed to death earlier than white people. We die at a higher rate than white people. We die with greater frequency than white people and with greater violence, right? The deaths tend to be more traumatic. Some examples of this, Black folk have a 24% higher mortality rate than white folks in the 30 largest US cities. And we suffered on average 74,000, feel it, 74,000 more deaths a year than white people from the years 2016 to 2018. In California cities in particular, the racial disparity in mortality is stark. We got only 537 deaths per 100,000 in the population, but San Francisco still had the lowest all-cause mortality rate. Let me make sure you understand. That means that out of all, San Francisco had a very low mortality rate, and still the mortality rate in that city was 92% higher for Black people than white folks. It had the lowest mortality rate, and even in the city with the lowest mortality rate in California, the mortality rate for Black people was 92% higher. Black parents are 2.5 more likely to lose a child than white parents. By the time Black Americans turn 60, we're 90% more likely than our white counterparts to experience at least 4 deaths of family members. Black children are 3 times more likely to lose a mother and more than twice as likely to lose a father by age 10 as compared to white children. By age 20, Black children are twice as likely to lose their mother and more than 50% more likely to lose a father. Nearly 90% of detained or incarcerated youth report experiencing the death of at least one close loved one, while 65% report multiple losses. I think what's important here is to understand we are dealing with bereaved youth, we are dealing with bereaved parents, we are dealing with bereaved people at an extremely high level. Black siblings are 20% more likely than white folks to lose their sibling by age 10, right? A 2017 study even found that by the time we turn 10 years old, Black children born in the US in the 1980s were 3 times more likely than white children to have lost their mothers and twice as likely to have lost their fathers. Why is this all important to me? I was a child in the 80s. I was one of those children. I'm one of the people who lost my mother young. I've lost dozens of cousins, friends, aunts, my grandparents, my childhood girlfriend, my soulmate and wife. Who did you lose? Who's missing from your world because of the conditions that we are forced to live? In fact, our mortality rates are so unequal. I mean, the inequality is so profound that our life expectancy in the US dropped dramatically in 2020 and again in 2021, making it the largest decrease over a 2-year period since the 1920s. Overdoses and pandemic deaths were the biggest contributors. You know, life expectancy fell the greatest actually for Native American communities, with African Americans falling at the next greatest. And Latinos after that, then whites, then Asians. I'm saying that overall, life expectancy for everybody fell, but for Black people, it fell dramatically. For Black folk, it dropped 4 years. 4 years. 4 years. Let's be clear, death is natural. It's going to come to us all. Nobody can get out of life alive. We know that. But the frequency, the violence, the age associated with our deaths indicate that these are deaths born of oppression, not nature. For Black people, right? Our deaths are America's canary in the coal mine. You know, for our bodies, our bodies have become the litmus test for American oppression, and these bodies are overexposed to unequal dying, and this brings us disproportionately to grief. And that's why I mentioned earlier the research of scholar Deborah Umberson says that exposure to death is a unique source of adversity for Black Americans that contributes to lifelong racial inequality. Research also shows that individuals who are exposed to greater losses earlier in life are more vulnerable to negative social and health outcomes for the rest of their lives, causing racialized precarity and greater cumulative disadvantage. What I'm saying is this death, this loss is manufactured by the conditions. And our grief is a response, not only to the loss, but to the conditions that manufactured the loss. So Black grief isn't just grief. It's not just grief personally. This is also something that becomes the ground for rebellion and for resistance. And I know somebody knows what I'm talking about. This is a place where we're talking about ancestral grief. We're talking about the difference between personal grief and collective grief. Now, we know that all losses are not traumatic, just like some loss is natural, right? Some loss is natural, and learning to live with natural loss is important. We need to do that. It builds, it is a skill that we need for living as human beings. But racialized losses are often traumatic. And traumatic loss, the way I define it, is any loss for which we are thoroughly unprepared that creates a shock to the system, right? Whether through death or through other means, when your presumptive reality, whatever that was before the loss, when that is called into question, and when it comes face to face with the reality of loss, you're experiencing traumatic loss. Have you experienced this? Think for a minute. When your reality has been pulled out from under you like a rug and knocked you off your feet. We experience cognitive dissonance in those moments, you know? And as a result, it messes with your mind. It messes with your personality, right? Now imagine this. Imagine being knocked off your feet for centuries. Imagine, you know, your great-great-grandmother, your great-great-great-grandfather, her father, your mama, your uncle, your cousins, all of these people over centuries experiencing this kind of traumatic loss, losing your land, losing your language. Somebody knows what I mean. Being forced into chattel slavery. That is not an experience of the past, it's an experience of the present, and it is made present by grief, by ancestral grief. This ancestral grief is collective, right? It's collective. When we experience grief personally, individually, that happens sometimes, right? We have that experience, but collective grief is when grief impacts the whole community, the whole city, the whole country, maybe even the whole world, as we know slavery did because it was transatlantic, and as the pandemic has, right? And collective grief exists because war, because natural disasters and other things these things that result in mass casualties or widespread tragedy, because those things exist, right? And so ancestral grief, right, is when that collective experience of grief and that collective experience of trauma is felt not only by a large group of people, but across generations as well, yeah? This ancestral grief or sometimes they call it transgenerational grief, right? It refers to situations where a grief event was so powerful, right, within a family or within a community or within a nation that it was carried on to the next generation, right? And sometimes for multiple generations thereafter. So in a sense, in a very, very real sense, this is the grief that keeps on taking, right? Grief, this is the gift that keeps on taking. Right, this is the grief that when combined with a discriminatory healthcare system, has resulted in widespread chronic illness within Black communities. Unattended bereavement and other forms of grief create severe health consequences. Now, studies show that even living in a context of grief can accelerate your own death. Unattended, unprocessed grief can result in intimate partner violence and abuse. My cousin was murdered by her husband, whose own unprocessed grief resulted in her death. Ashe, unattended, unprocessed grief. It's a deadly, deadly weapon. And I believe it's driving the increase in property crimes and interpersonal violence we're seeing right here in the Bay Area, the interpersonal violence and property crimes that is taking the life of a friend right now. The author, Barbara Deming, and the poet Audre Lorde wrote, "We cannot live without our lives." That's why the Constitution of the United States guarantees citizens' life as its first and most basic right. And yet, millions of us who live in this country are denied those constitutional protections. Now, if we have a right to live, then don't we too have a right to grieve? I mean, from the transatlantic slave trade of Africans and from Native American genocide to the colonization that set the conditions for the forced migration of most immigrants from Latin America, Asia, Africa, and across the globe, America's a country with a national identity built on the production of monumental loss and denial of grief. The Black experience in the United States, in the Caribbean, in Latin America, and in the US territories across the globe is historically marked by family separation, by intergenerational child loss of language, land, and extreme loss of life. Now, this generational grief is something immigrant families experience, as well as families who are native or indigenous to this country, as well as the ancestors of slaves, right? This generational grief, now it may be a weapon against us, but also can become the basis for our resistance, our shared and collective resistance. This racialized experience of death and grief is not only unequal, it's not only collective, it's not only traumatic and ancestral. We went through that, but it's also been disenfranchised, criminalized, and compounded. Now, I'm going to take 1 minute. I'm not going to take too much longer here, but disenfranchised grief is a grief that is unacknowledged by society and invalidated by social norms, okay? Grief is disenfranchised when the relationship between the griever and the deceased is not recognized, as can happen in queer and transgender relationships, or the death or loss is not recognized, and as has happened with conservatives who claim school shootings are fake, that the pandemic and the people who died in the pandemic, they're crisis actors. That's all fake, right? People in wars who have been disappeared by dictatorships, where there's no acknowledgement that the death even happened, right? And then number three, that when the griever's ability to grieve is not recognized, right? And so that's true for, let's think about sex workers who are assaulted and yet they're unable to report that assault. Their grief, their loss, the loss of safety is not recognized as real, right? And also the same thing might be true for those of us who mourn those who have died in jail, those who have died as addicts, those who have died by suicide, right? Or at the hands of the police. Black life is already incredibly vulnerable and precarious, and we're often not able to stop working, stop going to court, stop and get help, because the lives that we've lost are not deemed grievable, right? The lives that we've lost are not considered important, right? So our grief is disenfranchised. Now, beyond disenfranchisement, Black grief is also criminalized and suffocated. And Just like that, those who are trying to cope with bereavement and mourning are in isolation or in programs and therapeutic settings that just don't account for what they've lost and how those losses are central to their experience. Kids who have lost a parent, remember those 30,000 children in California that have lost a parent or caregiver. They act up in school and they are suspended. They are brought to into contact with school police. They are sent to jail. That is the criminalization of grief. Now, some people call that compounded, recursive, disenfranchised grief, they call it complicated grief, or they call it prolonged grief. They call it a mental health crisis, all right? But to me, it's not a mental health crisis. It's a social and political crisis. You know, Black bereavement scholar Tasha Borda said, grief will always be prolonged as long as injustice is prolonged. Now, this is the bottom line, right? We dying. We dying unequally, we dying unjustly, and we dying invisibly. Now, within this unequal pattern of loss and disenfranchised grief, our public mourning, our public acts of mourning, our congregational mourning, when we mourn together and visibly, that it may be a site of oppression, and a means of government repression, but it still is a site of rebellion. Look, Black grief gave us slave rebellions. Black grief gave us African decolonization movements. Black grief gave us the civil rights movement. Black grief gave us the Black power movements. It gave us the anti-apartheid movement. It gave us affirmative action. It gave us voting rights. And it gave us the movement for Black lives. And it may be what saves the planet and paves the future. Now, I'm going to close by just talking about the difference between reactionary loss and radical loss. Now, reactionary loss, you know, we all experience loss, but we don't all experience it the same way. We don't all experience it in the same rate. We talked about that. Now, white supremacy can privilege some and produce burdens for others, right? Now, white supremacy is the system that creates the imbalances that we talked about today, right? White supremacy works to reduce loss for white people and produce loss for BIPOC communities, Black, Indigenous, and people of color communities. Now, while we react to that loss, we're not all experiencing that grief the same way. White supremacy fuels reactionary loss. White supremacy, if we think about white supremacy as a system of racial hierarchy, it distorts the experience of white loss through the establishment of white privilege, right? White privilege confers racial protection to some folk and doles out harm and loss to other folk, right? It also keeps white folk from experiencing the power and the energy and the transformation of collective grief. So it hurts us all, right? This is reactionary loss, loss that is a refusal to process loss, a loss that acts in antagonism to grief, and instead replaces grief with gaslighting, replaces grief with empowered rage, and replaces grief with collective punishment. We've seen this over the last decade, right-wing extremist movements attempting to manipulate the experience of mass grief whenever somebody's killed by the police, in reaction to the pandemic, in reaction to the death of our transgender sisters. We've seen this over and over again. The Indigenous Canadian poet Harsha Walia wrote, "In a time when so many lives are considered ungrievable, grieving is a politically necessary act." Grief is our political environment. Grief is our weapon. Grief is our public narrative. Because of this, grief becomes a site of struggle. It becomes a site of liberation, a location for our transformation. As a person working in a movement for Black lives, I believe Black grief has a lot to teach us all. Black grief teaches us about Black love. And Black love is a framework that's available to us all. It's a framework that teaches us to love the people, to understand that our enemy is the system, not the people, right? That we are not the enemy. The enemy is institutional. Black love, Bell Hooks wrote in All About Love, Other Visions, to be loving is to be open to grief, to be touched by sorrow, even sorrow that is unending. Because America organized itself and built its core wealth on the enslavement of Black folk and the land theft from indigenous folk, its legal system Its civil system has been organized by anti-Blackness. Y'all know what I'm talking about. It positions everybody in a hierarchical relationship with Black at one end and of the extreme and white at the other, right? Black is as much a position as it is a people. You might be put in a position of Blackness even if you're not Black. And so we have to learn about America and how it works and how it treats people by watching its treatment of Black people. And we can learn ways to resist by watching how Black people resist and standing in solidarity with Black people who resist. Every Black-led movement for the past 300 years has been fueled by grief, and it has resulted in more rights for everybody. That's Black grief in action. That's Black love in action. We can learn from Black grief and congregational public mourning the art of grief as resistance, as dissent, as non-compliance to the status quo. Finally, we can learn from Black grief that we can heal as we fight. When loss becomes routine, our only choice for our full humanity is to allow grief to lead us in the direction of our freedom. Healing is the consequence and character of radical grief. In fact, instead of considering strategies to heal from grief, maybe we should consider that grief and mourning is the healing. Maybe we should think about how Black grief and mourning teaches us that the art of healing through grief is community organizing, that grief-fueled organizing is the healing itself as we face off with climate disaster, as we face off with gun violence and white nationalist attacks, a debt economy, pandemics, and violent police state. Our survival may depend upon our ability to mobilize grief into inspiration and collective action. Now, in the Black radical tradition, Black grief requires relief, reparation, and reconstruction. Relief, reparation, and reconstruction. Black grief and mourning brought us the first American Reconstruction, which happened after the Emancipation Proclamation was signed in the US. The second Reconstruction was after World War II and through the 1960s when the nation began to address longstanding civil and human rights abuses, again brought to us by Black grief. Across the world, change makers are attempting to ignite a third Reconstruction, a global Reconstruction that finishes the unfinished work of previous generations of activists in America. We learn from the leadership of Black people, Black indigenous people, Black immigrants, Black descendants of enslaved Africans in America, Black queer people, Black trans people, Black poor people, Black students and educators, Black organizers. We need a Reconstruction that changes and expands how we think about citizenship for all of us. We need a Reconstruction that transforms how we think about policing, safety, and security. We need a Reconstruction of the American economy and the American political system that's rooted in truth and reconciliation and reparations, and that changes conditions for us all across the globe. This is a Reconstruction that can be envisioned and embodied through the practice of Black grief, through the practice of radical loss. Now, we don't only learn from Black people. Radical loss is not the purview of one group. It is but it emerges from the Black radical tradition. But we also learn we started this talk with the Zapatistas, right? We can learn from those who rebuilt after the nuclear bombing of Hiroshima. We can learn from our indigenous kin and from migrants the world over. We know something about starting over, don't we? Don't we? Right? Black is not just a people or a position, it's also a politic. We can learn from the Black radical tradition. Radical means at the root. When we confront racial loss at its root, at the doorstep of murderous law enforcement, right in the faces of policymakers and corporate owners, we infuse the grieving process with the transformation process, with that energy, right? Where mourning becomes the work of collective governance. When we think about building power through the lens of grief and mourning, Black grief mobilized, that's radicalized grief. That's radical loss, which transforms our grief into a landscape for liberation, a site of social change. It evolves our grief into agency, where we can fight for greater safety, dignity, and belonging for all people. As a framework, radical loss helps us understand the systems that produce our losses and are responsible for our grief. Now, I'm just saying this is what we can do right now, right here, right? To alleviate and redistribute some of grief's racial burden. First off, we need to tell the truth about how grief impacts us. Are you ready to tell the truth about what you have lost, about how you have been hurt, about where you are mourning, where you are bereaved? Are you ready to tell that truth? Are you ready to feel as the second step in the process? Right? We want to squash that stuff down, but we don't want to do that no more. We want to let the truth come out. We want to feel. We want to be embodied whole people because we deserve to be, and we want to heal. Now, our healing, right, is not about some destination that we're gonna get to, some zenith point where everything gonna be great. No, the healing is actually where we can get in some agency and take some action to change our lives and change the world, right? Let yourself begin to feel. Let yourself begin to mourn in solidarity. Allow yourself the right and vulnerability to grieve, to experience the losses in your life, not just let them happen to you. Grief is a verb. You choose to do it, and you can do it the way you want to do it. Grieve collectively. Join an organization. You can join an organization and through that political education, learn that your personal grief is actually a collective experience. It's actually a structural experience. There's a reason your cousins and your friends keep dying. You can, as a member of a group, an organization, allow this kind of collective grief to become congregational, mourning. We are out here pouring into the streets. That's mourning. Protest is congregational public mourning. Let's get out there. Let's stand up. Let's mourn together out loud. Be willing to step off social media and step into the streets. Because the revolution ain't going to be on TikTok. It ain't going to be on Twitter. It ain't going to be on Snapchat. It ain't going to be on Instagram or Facebook. It's going to be live in our bodies, an expression of our grief. It's going to be as alive as you are. Right? You can remember that grief isn't only sorrow. It's also the songs that we sing when we say, ain't gonna let nobody turn me around, turn me around, turn me around, ain't gonna let nobody turn me around. I'm gonna keep on walking, keep on talking, marching up to Freedom Road. That is a grief song. That is a song of mourning. It's the joy and it's the laughter during the repast. It's the offerings on the Day of the Dead. It's the incense at the temple. It's the black we wear. It's the drums. It's the songs. It's the poems. It's the decision to live on the shoulders and in the breath of our ancestors. This is my prayer for the new morning. This is my prayer for the new day. And this is my prayer for you. Ashe, amen. And that's my word today. Thank you so much. And I'm so ready to hear any questions or comments or thoughts you may have. Thank you.
Thank you. Oh my goodness. Malkia, you're just brilliant. And thank you, gosh, so much for being here today. Folks, we're doing this in a webinar format, which means you type your question into the Q&A. In your Zoom window down at the bottom, there's like a little Q&A icon with some speech bubbles, and that's how you can write your question. It'll come to us as the panelists, and then we will pass it along to Malkia. So folks, we really do want to encourage people to take an opportunity to engage with them and all of that just wisdom and poetry that came out. Sangha, do you want to kick us off?
Ooh, this is hard to do over Zoom, and you did it, Malkia. So first of all, thank you for creating just this space to heal and or at least begin the process. And so many questions in my head. So many, I was just taking notes because there were just so many things you were saying. Firstly, the whole reorientation towards grief as something healthy is mind-blowing to me. So I'm going to sit and process that for a while. But at Diablo Valley College, of course, we always do think about how we can serve our students better, right? As an educator, I'm always thinking about that. As a parent, I'm thinking about, how I can be a better parent. And so as I was thinking about this, I saw that you mentioned gaslighting a couple of times, right? And how that can really compound the grief that a person is already experiencing. And I want to be very, very careful about that as I bring these topics and as I initiate these conversations in my classroom as well. And again, as an educator and as a parent, I do want to build the resilience you talked about in our students and so on. And I am always left wondering how to create that balance where you don't want to exacerbate harm, right? But at the same time, you're like trying to build that community and you're trying to build the resilience and say, okay, you know, as you said beautifully in your poem at the beginning, there will be living after all, right?
Yes.
How do do you have a magic answer to that?
Yeah, let me just start off by saying, look, whenever I talk about racism as a cause of collective grief, or racism, white supremacy as the cause of disparate mortality, somebody inevitably says, but what about the fact that Black people killing Black people? Black people are the reason, for that. First of all, I want to just say really clearly, the number one cause of death for Black men is heart disease, not murder, not homicide. The second greatest cause is cancer. The third is Alzheimer's, and the fourth is stroke. Homicide is not even the top four. So I just want to be clear about that. But even if it were, let's take that aside. Let's say if homicide was the number one cause of death for Black men in America, which it is not. What I said in my talk is that the failure, the inability to process grief, the inability to process ancestral grief, and the fact that that the harms are ongoing and continuing result in interpersonal violence. So homicide is a morbid symptom. Mm-hmm. It is a symptom of unprocessed Black grief as a result of white supremacy. And so I just want us to understand that violence and increasing violence is a symptom of inequality. Right? It's not the cause of inequality, it's the symptom of inequality. But the gaslighting is when people, what they want to do is not allow the systems and the institutions that are responsible for that inequality to be held responsible for it. Right? Mm-hmm. It's like when a abused woman beats a child. Will it transform the violence to focus in on putting her in prison? No, it won't. Mm-hmm. Right? What we're trying to do is it's called radical grief, radical loss. So we're trying to find the root. Mm-hmm. We're trying to look at the root and make change at the root. So that's why we don't spend too much time focusing on individuals as the cause of collective grief. We're looking at systems. We're looking at structures, and we're looking at history and context. Individuals are a site of change for sure. We want to heal each other. We want to heal ourselves, but we're not here to blame people whose grief expresses itself in violence and rage. That's not helpful. Mm-hmm. So that's just one way that I think about this question of gaslighting, and this question of how do we deal with interpersonal violence. It's a real issue, but it is not the cause of disparate mortality. It is not the cause of collective grief, and it is not the cause of that any of those imbalances. Mm-hmm. Does that answer a little bit?
Yes, lots to think about. Lindsay, you want to address the question?
Yeah, we've got a question here. Well, there's some sweet love for you in the Q&A, but also a question asking, can you reflect more on the relationship between mass media and grief? I'm especially curious where you might see there's room for rebellion within Hollywood as an industry. And if you could pull from some of your media justice work, I would love to hear it.
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, so I think mass media and grief intersect in a few ways. So number one, let's think about grief as public narrative, right? And you know, the stories that we are told about grief is that it is, especially about Black grief, is that it is overreaction. It is fake. Where we are, we see these kinds of narratives, not so much in the news, but certainly in kind of the social media, universe. And then this spills over into Hollywood depictions of Black grief as just like the desperately crying mother over a casket, the and the depictions of Black mortality are always violence, right? When's the last time you saw a movie about a Black person with cancer, even though it's the third leading cause of death for Black people? We don't. When's the last time you saw anything about sickle cell, even though it's a cause of a significant cause of death for Black people, uniquely to Black people? We don't see Black people struggling with illness in the media. We don't see any of that. We see Black people as perpetrators or victims of crime. And when you see Black people in that way, in that limited criminalized view, then Black grief, there's no room for it. It is grief for ungrievable people, right? For people that have been deemed ungrievable and insignificant and criminal. And so I think that Hollywood, if you will, Ava DuVernay is doing an amazing job of this, both through Queen Sugar, but also through one of her earlier films, I Will Follow, really looking at in depth at Black grief and how we hold grief as Black people. I think we need more of that. We need more of that. We need more news stories about other ways we die. We need more news stories to actually comment on protest as a form of public mourning. These are ways that mass media could change how we think about grief and how people understand not only Black grief, but Black rebellion and Black life. And the Black Lives Matter is a term. The reason that term exists is because we live in a nation and in a world that says the opposite. Right? And if Black lives don't matter, then Black grief don't matter either. And so we're trying to transform that, right? And make it a world where our grief does matter and where our grief is given its due. Our grief produces change for everybody. Half the rights we have as a nation, we have because Black people's grief spurred on a movement to demand those things. And so I just, I think that that's some of what Hollywood and mass media can do. I hope that answers the question.
Are you about to go, Sangha?
Yeah, no, and folks, please do type in more questions, because otherwise I'll just keep asking questions.
And you know what, also, if you don't have any questions, I just also love to hear, your stories of grief, your experiences of loss, and how, if anything, this talk resonated with you or didn't. Where are you like, nah, that doesn't feel accurate to me? I'm down to hear that too.
Yeah, we have a comment. Thank you so much for this presentation. I'll be thinking about it for a long time. As a person who's personally and ancestrally benefited from white supremacy, I'm self-conscious about how to be sensitive about acknowledging Black grief without co-opting it. In other words, recognizing the truth of this grief while recognizing that I feel it in a vastly different way.
I mean, I think that the fact that you're saying that is the right first step. But also, maybe I could offer, I think that for white people, the way to acknowledge Black grief and to help shape a world in which Black grief is recognized, valued, and validated is actually to take a look at white grief. You know, to take a look at both the system of white supremacy that reduces loss for white people. Now, not everybody grieves. Everybody's lost somebody. You know what I mean? We all experience loss, but whether the loss you experience actually fuels a transformative collective experience or fuels an individualist, bit deeply personal internal experience, that's racialized to some degree, you know. And looking at that, exploring why that is, exploring how the racialization of grief has harmed you as a white person, limits you as a white person, doesn't allow you to enjoy the collective nature and the beauty and richness that comes with mourning together. That is something I think worth challenging, and in doing so, in breaking down that system of racial hierarchy and how it affects all of our ability to grieve, you have done a service. You will have done a service. You know, I truly believe that whenever we're talking about transforming racism, we begin with ourselves. We begin where it lives in our body. You know, when we embody anti-racism, we do so because we began at home. So I believe that that's one way to look at it, and I'm so grateful for that comment and that thought. Thank you so much.
Yeah, and then we've got one more, which I think maybe is a good note to end on. And this is asking, of course, about liberatory practices that work for you, paving your own personal way towards freedom and liberation.
Word, thank you. And, you know, thank you. I see that Sam, and, you know, me and Sam participate in a community called Pandemic Joy, and we do a monthly practice called the Freedom Cleanse. And, you know, these are communities that I began, they're virtual communities that I began at the start of the pandemic because I was lonely, to keep it 100. My wife had passed away in 2018, and I had just ended my job of 20 years in 2019, you know, and in February 2020, you know, we started having a global pandemic, and I was isolated. And so I said, you know what, I said to myself, how can I allow this grief that I am experiencing to strengthen me and to build community instead of lose it? And I did that by starting these virtual communities. Once a month, we gather virtually. We meditate, we exercise, we set goals, and we cheer each other on. Some goals are, you know, physical, about, you know, food and whatever, walking or whatever. And some goals are not. Some people trying to get off social media. Some people trying to get the negative talk out their minds. But it's the practice together that is the point, you know? And we do that together. And then every Sunday we gather and we sing, we meditate, you know, we hear from people in our community, and our whole goal is to come together as grievers, as bereaved people, and transform that grief into something inspirational. Every Tuesday I run a grief group online. And same thing, you know, activists and people who care about justice come together to transform our grief into healing. And so those are some of the ways that I do it. I mean, I believe the framework of Salvatore Ambulato. That's it will be done by walking. You know, I believe in walking. I believe in the road. And so, you know, I hope that we can all be on that road together. Thank you.
Thank you. Like,
Thank you.
just so sincerely. This is just what we needed today.
Right on.
Yeah.
Y'all have a blessed, beautiful time, and I would love to see you all again.
Tonga, you want to close us out?
I was just looking at that last comment there as well. Yeah. Just before we close out, again, thank you, Malkia, but you did mention MediaJustice, and I was just wondering if you could say a few words about what the organization is, and then if our students are interested, how they can get involved.
Absolutely. MediaJustice is an organization working around tech policy, working around media bias, and working for media justice inside of the media and the technology field. And if you want to get involved there, you can definitely just go on MediaJustice.org and follow our campaigns. We work on to end spying. We work to end the role of technology in unjust policing. We work to get broadband to all our communities. So there's a bunch of different things that we do. I'm working on grief as public narrative. If you want to reach out to me, you can find me at malkia@mediajustice.org, and feel free to reach out to me. I'm always up for a conversation. So thank you. Oh, you can follow me on Twitter. I'm at Culture Jedi. That's about it though. Can't find me no other way.
Thank you for
Thank
creating this deeply moving and healing space. I would also like to thank Lindsay Shively for bringing us this powerful speaker, and Christina Gomez for keeping us organized and providing us tech support throughout. We couldn't do it without her. DVC's marketing team for creating our visuals and flyers, and of course, James Noel, our dean, who has supported us. Please do remember to fill out the survey that helps us to keep improving our speaker series. Thank you all for being here. We'll continue working towards our vision of hope, healing, and community. Please join us for our next event. Next week, we have the Black History 101 Mobile Museum, Hip Hop at 50. It's on Wednesday, February 15th. The exhibit is going to be from 10 a.m. to 3 p.m. and the presentation will be from 12:45 to 1:45. So Wednesday, Feb 15th in the San Ramon Academic Support Center, and then Thursday, Feb 16th in our Pleasant Hill Diablo room, right? So the room above our cafeteria. All of that information is available always on our website, DVC Student Equity Speaker Series. Thank you all so much for joining us. We hope to keep seeing you.